Today we are talking to Dr. Ian Gold, a McGill University philosopher and Canada Research Chair. And one of his specialties is delusion. So let's get started. Can you tell us what the traditional idea of what delusions are?
Well, delusions are strange or bizarre beliefs that are one of the two essential characteristics of psychotic illness. Those are a family of illnesses that include schizophrenia as the best known one. We don't have a very good definition of delusion. We don't really have a definition at all, but certainly delusions are characterized by very, very improbable and very often bizarre contents.
Yeah, okay. Now, you've written that there are problems with this definition. For example, there are delusions that don't qualify for the definition, and there are lots of non-delusional beliefs that do qualify. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So suppose I'm a psychiatrist and someone comes into my office and says to me, Dr. Gold, I was given a COVID injection yesterday, and I woke up this morning and realized that Bill Gates is now tracking me with a microchip that was in that injection. I'm going to think that that's, all things equal, that's a delusional idea. But if someone says to me, I was given a COVID injection and I suddenly realized that everyone around the world is being tracked by Bill Gates by means of microchips and COVID injection. Psychiatrists have fairly strong intuitions that the latter is not a clinical symptom. It's a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories provide one of the best examples of a belief that's really bizarre. At least some conspiracy theories are really bizarre, that are often in a way quite similar in tone to delusions. They're often suspicious in nature. And yet practitioners, clinicians have pretty clear intuitions that those beliefs are not delusional. When you ask them what makes one strange belief a clinical symptom and the other strange belief with a very similar idea, not a clinical symptom, we don't have a good theory of that. And the definitions that have been proposed don't seem to capture the essential features of delusions.
So are delusions and conspiracy theories comorbid? Do people tend to have them both?
There is, interestingly, there hasn't been much work on this until COVID. I think because conspiracy theories sort of moved to the center of culture during COVID, or at least toward the center of culture during COVID, there was an explosion of work on conspiracy theories. That's the first thing. Conspiracy theory is actually a fairly recent topic in experimental psychology, surprisingly. So there was a kind of explosion of work on the topic, which has been fantastic, and quite a bit of work looking at overlap between conspiracy ideation and delusion. Even in my lab, we did a bit of work, and we found some interesting similarities. But it's still very early days, and I wouldn't at all want to suggest that the two phenomena are, two versions of the same thing. It looks like there may be some correlations in people who have one, who may also have others. But certainly I want to say that conspiracy theories have a similar feel to them. As I say, they're often suspicious. They are sensitive to some of the same things that delusional ideas are sensitive to.
Yeah, and I've noticed that conspiracy theories are almost always about people.
Exactly right.
Like it, and most pseudoscience is about people, actually. It's I think like the main one I found that wasn't is Worlds in Collision, which is some crazy cosmological thing. But most of them are like crystal healing and this and that.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so the clinical psychologists differentiate them, I guess, presumably because it's important to differentiate them for diagnosis or treatment.
Yeah, I mean, my guess about how people make the distinction, how clinicians make the distinction is just practically, which is to say people who have delusions are people who also tend to have other problematic symptoms, whereas people who have conspiracy theories are largely otherwise, high functioning. And sorry, I don't want to suggest that they wouldn't otherwise be high functioning, but one can have a conspiracy theory, without having any other obvious behavioral manifestations. Now, that's also true of some rare delusions. There is a disorder called delusional disorder that's characterized exclusively exclusively by the presence of a very, very narrow theme, delusional theme, and people who have delusional disorder seem to have those delusions in a very stable way. There's no decline, there's no deterioration, and they have families and jobs and so on. So again, there's no easy way theoretically to distinguish delusions from conspiracy theories. But I think on the whole, people who have delusional ideas that are persistent also tend to have other problems. Now, I should also say one other thing. Delusions are states that people can have for relatively brief periods. And there we identify delusions just in virtue of the content. We say if somebody has this kind of belief, even for a short time, that's a delusion.
Right. So some people think that delusional people are just irrational. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, so I don't think so. Irrationality in the context of psychosis is a really interesting and important topic, especially for a philosopher, because on the one hand, we tend to think of psychotic illness as a kind of a paradigm of irrationality. If you have a theory of rationality and irrationality that doesn't say that people with psychosis are irrational, there's something wrong with your theory. And yet I think there's good reason to doubt that people with psychosis are irrational in quite the way that philosophers and economists and logicians are interested in irrationality. But the most obvious sense in which people with psychosis are not irrational is that there's very little evidence that people with psychosis don't reason well. On the contrary, people with psychosis are often quite sophisticated in the way that they reason about their delusions, in the sense that when you challenge people with delusions by providing evidence or arguments or whatever, they're often quite sophisticated and subtle in the way that they reason around that evidence to come up with an argument, quite a plausible argument, for saying that their delusion is true. There's a wonderful example, I'll give you a paper from some years ago of a patient who had the Cotard delusion, the rather rare belief that you're dead. And there's a passage in this paper where the authors say, her doctors said to JK, the patient, have you ever noticed that your heart is beating? Have you ever noticed that your bladder is full? Wouldn't you take those feelings as evidence that you're alive? And JK responds by saying, well, that's very interesting, but I'm dead, so that can't be evidence that I'm alive, right? So JK does not respond in a kind of unpredictable, nonsensical way. On the contrary, she makes a logical move, which is a quite sophisticated move, in order to say the delusion is true and the status of the evidence is what's questionable.
Yeah, and I'm familiar with, I'm not implying that religious people are mentally ill, but I did read how a lot of religious beliefs that people not in the religion might think of as just completely irrational. The people who believe these things are not irrational either. Like it just seems like the mind, and we maybe can say this in general, that the mind is not just like completely rational or completely irrational, but we have pockets of kinds of beliefs that can be delusions or conspiracies or religions.
Exactly right.
Paranormal beliefs, right?
And we see this in much less dramatic ways. I mean, self-deception is a classic example, right? How is it that I could deceive myself when I know that I'm deceiving somebody? If that someone is me, then how do I manage that, right? Wishful thinking. There's all sorts of ways in which we hold beliefs that are not supported by the evidence that we know we shouldn't hold in some sense of no, and yet we manage to do it, presumably because we managed to parcel out different aspects of mental function.
So this gets into the idea about what beliefs are and how they're organized. And can you tell us a bit about this idea of the semantic web that cognitive scientists bandy about?
Yeah, there's a general idea that I think cognitive scientists and philosophers and lots of people hold, which says that beliefs are a web. And what they mean by this is that the things that we believe are connected by means of inferential links to other beliefs. So let me give you an example. I believe that today is Tuesday, and that's why I turned up to have a conversation with you. If I suddenly had the belief that, no, it's not Tuesday, it's Wednesday, that change in belief would affect other beliefs. I'd have to now believe that I'm not having a conversation with Jim Davies. I'd have to believe that I made a mistake on my calendar, and so on and so forth. Beliefs tend to be connected to many, many others. So when you add a new belief, it generates new connections to old beliefs. And if you remove a belief, then other beliefs are also going to be reorganized. And so the thought is there are other aspects of this idea, but the thought is that beliefs are not isolated phenomena. They're part of a large group of mental states that are all somehow connected.
Right. So adding and removing beliefs also can change other beliefs, right?
Exactly.
So if I believe that tonight I'm going to come home and my wife's going to have dinner ready for me and then we're going to watch a movie, and then I find out she's not going to be home tonight, it changes both the belief that I'm going to come home and have dinner and I'm going to have a movie. So there's this like rippling effect, which makes a lot of sense. But you're suggesting that the phenomena of delusions leans on this theory a little hard. So you want to talk about that?
I do, yeah. So I think that delusions show that actually this idea that belief is a web is oversimplified. I actually think, and I'm not the only person to think this, but this is a minority view, that it makes sense to imagine that we have systems, specialized systems, that might be akin to, say, perceptual systems like the visual system, that are devoted to acquiring beliefs around a particular topic, a special topic of importance, and that those systems might operate in relative isolation and relatively autonomously. And I think what's happening with delusions is that one of those systems, one of those autonomous belief generating systems, has gone wrong. And in virtue of the way to which it's gone wrong, the beliefs that it generates are both distorted and also hard to get rid of.
Yeah. You talked about delusions taking on a few forms, and that they just tend to fall into some categories. And I think there are like 13. We don't need to talk about all 13, but do you want to talk about, can you give us a feel for what these categories are like?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll start actually just by emphasizing how surprising this is, because if you ever meet somebody who is floridly delusional, say someone with schizophrenia who's not well treated, one has the sense of someone who's got a lot of strange beliefs. They talk about all sorts of strange ideas. They seem very, very alien in the way they're thinking about the world. And yet when you look at the psychiatric literature, the summary of clinical lore, what you find is all of those specific beliefs tend to fall into a bunch of motifs, a bunch of themes. And those themes are ones that we're familiar with. So, for example, if you look across culture and across history, every culture has accounts of people with what we now call persecutory beliefs, paranoia, people who believe that other people are conspiring to harm them. These beliefs are everywhere. And if you just count up the kinds of beliefs that people have when they turn up in a psychiatric emergency room, these are always the most common, no matter what culture you're looking at, no matter what time you're looking at. There are other beliefs that are similar, that have this kind of flavor of worry about other people. So delusions of jealousy, for example, are specific versions of a worry that other people are out to harm me. In this case, my partner and the person that she might be cheating with. So there are, as I say, first of all, it's a striking fact that there are relatively few ideas that people with delusions have that are delusional. And those ideas tend to cluster around a couple of things. One is this fear of other people, and not a fear of bad things in general, right? So there's no fears, that I'm going to be swallowed up by an earthquake. The fears are all directed at other people. They're not typically fears of physical harm. So people with delusions tend not to worry that they're going to be attacked by someone. They tend to worry about other people exploiting them or betraying them or manipulating them. That's one set of beliefs. Then there's a smaller set of beliefs that seem quite incompatible on first blush. And these are beliefs that the person who has them is very powerful or very special. These are called grandiose beliefs. And there are other versions of grandiose beliefs that are a bit more specialized. I say these are a bit strike you as incompatible because, of course, one tends to think that if you're afraid of other people, it must be because you're vulnerable. You're not very powerful. Powerful people tend to be less vulnerable to the threats of other people. And so it's a puzzle that people with delusions often feel both very vulnerable to other people and also very powerful with respect to other people. And I think this is because the the special purpose mechanism devoted to that generates delusions when it's dysfunctional is a mechanism concerned with detecting other people's threats, dangers coming from other people, and also in responding to those threats by asserting a kind of social power.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get into that. But I just want to clarify, I saw a talk that Dr. Gold gave recently. I thought it was great, which is why he's here. And you mentioned something about believing that George Clooney's in love with you, even though you've never met George Clooney. So are you saying that kind of thing is somewhat common, but believing that your friend's wife is in love with you is not? Or wouldn't be classified as delusion, or how?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So let me make a couple of distinctions here. So let's take that belief. Suppose I believe George Clooney is in love with me. Of course, that particular belief, the belief about George Clooney, that might not be very common. In other words,
Right.
if you look, yeah. So if you look across patients and you ask how many people have beliefs about George Clooney, it may be a very, very small number. But that's an example of a particular delusional belief that falls into a category. And that category is called erotomania. And it's characterized by having a belief that somebody who is generally very high social status is in love with you. And once you think about categories, as I say, there are very, very few of them. And you see versions of those beliefs across different cultures.
Right. So the person being powerful is an important part of it.
Absolutely.
So someone thought that, just somebody they knew was in love with them. Wouldn't they?
Typically not. I mean, one doesn't want to make incredibly rigid rules because there are always exceptions. But
Right.
yeah, in general, it looks like that delusion seems to be essentially connected to the idea of a high status person. So classically, it was somebody a formal high social status. So the first patient described in the literature believed that King George of England was in love with her, right? Mm-hmm. Formal high social status. In the 21st century, it might be people like George Clooney because celebrity generates a kind of status that wasn't the case before. But what those beliefs have in common is, that somebody is important in our culture and that important person has an interest in me.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's interesting. It reminds me of how OCD also has very specific categories of
it's
counting thresholds, and that those are also a lot of the categories of religious ritual, which I think is fascinating.
I actually think that there's a deep connection between delusions and OCD. It's another topic, and I'm not expert.
Write a book about that, and we'll have you back.
Yeah. But I think there's connections. It's really cool.
All right. So it seems like delusion is one of those things that's hard to define without a theory. And this is something I encountered. I did a deep dive into the consciousness research, and it seemed very hard. I think philosophers have a name for this, explanans or explanandum, but the thing you're explaining in the explanation, but when you try to define it, you end up bringing theory into your definition. Do you think that's the case?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a thing that philosophers are interested in generally. I mean, I think in science, this is the universal problem, right? We have a question that we're trying to answer, and there are phenomena that we're trying to understand. How do you begin to theorize about the phenomena when you don't have any kind of theory? And how do you identify the phenomena that you should be trying to explain when you don't have a story about which phenomena are connected? Well, all you do is you begin somewhere and you start to think about things and you build a theory and you go back to the phenomena and you see whether the theory matches, and then you change your theory and you just have to start somewhere and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I think the problem in the context of delusion is that people have been tempted by the idea, mistakenly, that we can generate a definition of delusions without a theory, because delusions have these very, very striking characteristics, right? They're irrational. They're the result of poor reasoning. They're not sensitive to the evidence. They are intrinsically bizarre, and so on and so forth. And so we think that because these characteristics are so striking, we can a priori decide which phenomena are delusions, and then we just start theorizing about them. And I don't think that's the case. I actually think that too much is being said about delusions outside of the context of a scientific theory. And we need to treat delusions the way we treat any other phenomena. You do some theory, you go back to the evidence, and you do that over and over and over until you start to make sense of it.
So this is very vindicating for me because this is something I try to communicate to people a lot. So I'm just going to put a fine point on it.
Good.
In many cases, and I see this a lot in cognitive science, coming up with a really strict definition can be very premature and can lead you astray. And people don't like that. People are like, oh, you have to define your terms. And I forget. I wish I could credit the philosopher. I read some philosopher who made the example of water. It's like, how would you define water before we had a molecular theory of hydrogen and oxygen? You'd say, well, it's the stuff that sort of falls from the sky and we can drink it and it's tasteless most of the time. And you just have this whole bunch of phenomena that we all kind of agree is water. But that's really not a definition the way most people want when they ask for it. But to define water before we even knew what molecules were would have been a rather silly thing to do, because then the theory that we came up with wouldn't have applied to the premature definition.
Precisely. There's a very famous passage in a early 20th century philosopher of science, Otto Neurath, who describes scientific theory as repairing your ship while you're on the sea. Right? What do? I mean, you put a little. You make a little change here and you see what happens, and you then make a little change there and so on. So I think you're quite right. I think jumping to a definition is generally a mistake. You begin, as you say, with some observations and you build a theory, and then you discover actually the stuff that falls from the skies and the stuff in the rivers. There's some differences there, and you start to theorize about those and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of a coevolution of observation and theorizing that leads to an understanding of the world around us, rather than beginning with a nice, clear definition and then theorizing about it.
All right. Our audience has waited long enough. Let's talk about your social theory of delusions.
Okay.
About that.
So, yes, I think that the standard view in literature when I started working on this was that delusions begin with some sort of strange experiences and then reasoning about those experiences, or either in a healthy way or in a disordered way. My own view, as you imply, is that delusions are restricted to a very narrow domain. They're not about thinking about things generally, they're about thinking about the social world. And the best evidence for that view comes from something I mentioned already, which is if you look at the beliefs that we call delusions, without any theory, if we just ask psychiatrists, tell us which beliefs are delusions, those beliefs turn out to revolve around a very, very narrow set of topics, almost exclusively around the people that we live with, including ourselves, and in particular around worries about what dangers those people might pose to us. Now, given that strange or pathological beliefs could have been about any topic whatsoever, an indefinitely large set of topics, it seems to me utterly implausible to suppose that it's a coincidence that delusions are about the social world. So with that very sort of fundamental, possibly wrong observation, I started to think that we should ask why it might be the case that delusions exclusively focus on the social world. And the hypothesis, as I've suggested, goes like this. It makes good evolutionary sense to suppose that we would be very, very attentive to social risks. And here's why. The virtue of living in a social world for human beings, primarily, is cooperation. Right? We can do things together that we couldn't possibly do apart. I mean, having a conversation on Zoom is something that I would never have come up with, and an indefinitely large series of individual human beings working alone probably would have never come up with. So we get a huge advantage by living in the same place, working together. But of course, as we all know from bitter experience, some people are good to work with and some people are bad to work with, because there are people who will take advantage. And given the incredible centrality and importance of cooperation, it makes sense that evolution would have endowed us with some ideas about how to differentiate between people who might be good cooperators and people who might be bad cooperators. And so I'm imagining that there is a special cognitive mechanism devoted to forming beliefs about whether people are likely to be bad for us, to be dangerous, to betray us, to exploit us, and so on, as opposed to people who are trustworthy. That to me doesn't seem like a very controversial hypothesis. There are other hypotheses in cognitive science that are not dissimilar. The one that I like best is the hypothesis that gossip serves a very similar function. Why do we love gossip? We love to hear nasty things about people. One hypothesis, may be wrong, but one hypothesis is it's very useful to know potentially nasty things about people. So if you ever encounter them, you know to stay away from them, right? So I don't know anything about Jim Davies. I just know that, oh, he's never going to pay for coffee if you go out for a coffee with him, right? Okay, so I hear this gossip and I think, all right, he's somebody I'm not going to engage with. Okay, so let's suppose that it's true that being sensitive to social risks is evolutionarily valuable. The hypothesis that I'm working with is that if a system devoted to social risks goes wrong in various ways, two things might happen. One is that you might get distorted, strange, bizarre thoughts about social risk. And I think delusions fit that bill, persecutory delusions particularly. So you might have the idea that all the taxi drivers in Montreal are conspiring to harm me. That seems, on the face of it, like a very, very improbable belief. So it's a distortion of something that might be a natural worry. And the second thing that happens is that those beliefs are very hard to get rid of. Now, it's the latter thing that actually really matters. And here's why. We all have pretty strange thoughts that go through our minds periodically, right? So, I watched The Matrix, say, a movie that philosophers love to theorize about. And for a minute, I think, gee, I wonder if I'm living in the Matrix. Or I wonder if maybe I don't look just a little bit like Keanu Reeves in the right light. I have this crazy idea. But what makes me psychologically well-functioning is that I immediately realize that that's very, very improbable, or at least it's a belief that I don't have any evidence for adopting. But if there's something wrong with my beliefs, particularly these social beliefs, that makes them inaccessible to the capacities that assesses beliefs and revise beliefs, then those beliefs might persist and sort of put down roots in such a way that you can't get rid of them in any traditional way, not very easily anyhow. That's the idea.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's there's like a monitoring reasoning system that keeps these percolating beliefs under wraps or under control. But when there's something wrong, it's like, yes, they take root, and your example from the Cotard delusion, they even force other beliefs around it to get in line.
Exactly.
So it's like the delusion is the first principle, and everything else has got to change.
That's exactly right.
To fit it in, Oh, yeah, wow.
That's exactly right.
So there's some experimental evidence that you can point to that would support this idea.
Yeah, so there is some evidence that people with delusions are a bit more sensitive to social threats than other people. Not as much as one would like, and that's, I think, because the right sorts of experiments haven't been done. I think threat is a very big, fuzzy concept, and there are lots of experiments looking at things that are dangerous or threatening in the context of psychosis. But to design an experiment in which it's a particular kind of social threat that's at issue has not been done very much. And it's something that we're hoping to do in the next few months in my lab. So we're going to be using paradigms from experimental economics to generate quite specific kinds of risks that somebody that you're interacting with might betray you or be dishonest. And my hope is that those kinds of experiments will show that people with psychosis are much more sensitive to social threat, to betrayal and disloyalty than other people.
Great. And do you have some ideas about what brain areas might be involved?
Yeah, I mean, this is all very, very speculative. A lot of the thought that I have comes from some work we've done, not in the schizophrenia literature, but in the literature on dementia. So you may know that people with dementia, any form of dementia, Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, often have psychotic symptoms, including delusions. And in fact, they're remarkably common. The literature is not huge, but the evidence suggests that somewhere between a third and 2/3 of all people with dementia develop delusions. It's a real problem and one not much discussed. But in my lab, we've done some surveying of the literature on delusions in dementia because the neuropathology of dementia is a bit better understood, I think, than the neuropathology of schizophrenia. And a series of brain regions that together is usually called the default mode network seems to be implicated. Of course, the default mode network is a very sexy topic at the moment, and lots of things are implicated as default mode functions. But the thought that we have is that somehow the default mode network, which is often associated with daydreaming, mind wandering, with thinking that's disconnected from sensory input, I think of the default mode network in part as a kind of a storyteller. It generates all sorts of ideas that sometimes manifest in consciousness as daydreams, as mind wandering. I suspect that delusions are, sorry, we also know, I should add, that the default mode network is interested in social cognition. It's interested in how to navigate the world of other people. And so the hypothesis we're working with is that one of the functions of the default mode network is to generate stories of threat about other people. And it generates these stories as a kind of continuous narrative about the risky social world. And then those narratives get sort of sent on to the more sort of rational, as it were, the parts of the brain, the executive network part of the brain that evaluates things in a more in a more rational way, and typically will verify to see whether there is some sort of real risk. And if there isn't, it will say, in effect, no, there's no risk here. You can shut that down. You can stop telling that story. And so I think what's happening in delusions is that the default mode network is in some sense disordered, and so it generates distorted worries, and it's also disconnected from the other parts of the mind that might be inclined to tell the default mode network to stop generating those stories. And so you get both distorted and persistent beliefs of the kind that we see in patients.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Ravanso's dream theory.
Yeah.
That always looking like dreams are a way to practice social threat situations and stuff.
It's interesting that psychosis, madness, and dreams have often been cited as sort of two versions or two features of the same sort of mental state. And I don't think the traditional way of thinking about that is quite right. But I think the kind of thing you're mentioning is right. That both dreams and delusions are stories of a certain kind.
Well, and social.
And exactly right. Yeah. And they're stories about how to handle the social world. And so I think there are deep connections between these two phenomena that haven't yet been explored quite enough.
Yeah. Okay, great. So to understand how the suspicion system works to maintain delusions, you've invoked dual process theory of mind. Would you explain to our listeners a bit about what that is?
Yeah, so the dual process theory of mind is a kind of a general approach to cognition. It's not specific to any one form of cognition. And what it says is the following. There are certain important cognitive functions that have to happen kind of quickly and with inadequate information. And so it's important to have the ability to generate a quick judgment or engage in a behavior under conditions of uncertainty when there's time pressure. But those forms of cognition are so important that if you have the time and you have more information, it's worth spending that time to explore that information. And so we have parallel functions, one sort of function of which is devoted to quick and dirty judgments about things, and the other function of which is devoted to careful assessment of the very same question. Okay, so there are lots of domains in which one can see this. A classic one is mental arithmetic. So if I say to you, what's 2 and 2, you can say 4, and 4 and 4 is 8, and 8 and 8 is 16, and so on. You're not thinking about it. You're generating a quick automatic answer. But at some point, if I say, well, what's 512 and 512? You might have to pause, and you might have to think, and you might have to work it out. And if I make a mistake, if I make a mistake with my quick and dirty answers, this other more careful system might notice it and go back and correct that mistake. Okay, so this happens in all sorts of domains of cognition where you have sort of quick and dirty cognitive capacities that run in parallel with careful capacities. And I think in the context of delusion, you see something similar. Delusions, I think, are generated by a kind of belief system that's quick and dirty, that's constantly generating possible social threats. sending up sort of alarms, setting up smoke signals, saying, here's the thing that you might want to believe. There's the thing that you might want to believe. And then what happens is a parallel system assesses the evidence and says, yes, this is really a cause for concern, or no, this isn't a cause for concern. And I think what's happening in delusion, this is another way of saying what I was saying before about the default mode, is that these quick and dirty responses to social threat are not being overridden. They're not being checked by this more careful, slower system. And so you wind up with beliefs that really don't fit the evidence, that don't fit in the broad landscape of one's beliefs.
Yeah. So, okay. So it sounds like you think the suspicion system is a old sort of encapsulated system one thing, and our rational system two tries to keep it in check. But I guess, so are delusions problems with the suspicion system, the rational system, or both, in your opinion?
So I think primarily it's a problem with the crosstalk between them.
Okay.
So I think that there's probably more to be said about this, but I think the primary thing, the fact that delusions are so persistent, comes from the fact that there's a lack of communication. In particular, the kind of rational, thoughtful system seems to not be able to shut down the other system. So we just seem to be unable to sort of turn down the alarm.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm thinking though, there are times when I try not to do this, but there are times when I believe something, and my rational mind says that's not true, and I either believe it anyway or I'm very tempted to do it.
Yep.
So and to me that's like a classic dual process.
Yep.
Like I want the chocolate, but I shouldn't have it, or something like that. But I'm conscious of both. But it sounds like for people suffering from delusions, they don't actually are conscious of the irrationality, but believe it anyway.
It's complicated. So in fact, there probably is a period in the development of psychosis when you have exactly that.
Okay.
So in what's called the prodromal period of psychosis, especially of schizophrenia. So let me back up for a sec. One can't get a diagnosis, say, of schizophrenia until you've had symptoms for 6 months. That's just definitional. And that early period, that 6-month period, is called the prodrome. And sort of long story why that is. But in that period, you do find people saying things like, I feel like people are looking at me funny, or I feel there's somebody behind me, but I know that's not true. The patients seem to have the idea, they have what psychiatrists call insight, that they have this belief, but it doesn't seem right to them. So they still have some critical ability to notice that this belief isn't right. So I've hinted at, or suggested a couple of times now, there's probably two things wrong here. One is that the system is generating disordered beliefs to begin with, and the second is that there's a disconnection between the system that's generating the threat belief and the rational system. So I think what's happening is that the beliefs start to get generated, and the rational system is still functioning, and it says, no, this isn't right. You should stop this, and yet the threat belief persists. And I think what happens in the so-called conversion from this prodromal period to chronic illness is that somehow the rational system is disconnected. It's shut off from this other system for reasons I don't yet have an idea about. And at that stage, people lose their insight. They lose their ability to say, oh, I have this strange idea, but I know it's not right. And one of the things that psychiatrists do now, even with psychosis, is they engage in psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy in particular, precisely to re-engage insight, to help people try to learn again that certain beliefs are intrinsically implausible and to challenge those beliefs. And there's good evidence that that kind of therapy works.
Yeah, it's subtle, right? And I'm not trying to be challenging here, but it's just like when but the rational system does gets recruited to defend the delusion, right? So it's sort of like the delusion takes control of or is now in charge of and calling the shots for the rational system and using it as a tool.
Exactly. So I think, yeah. So, I mean, as I say, there's a bit of a complicated story here, and it's a story that unfolds over time. So what you said, I think, is basically right. At least the hypothesis I'm working with at the moment goes like this. You have the distorted threat that arises. The rational system says, no, that's not right. But the threat continues to be produced. There's a kind of conflict between these two stories. One story says the world is threatening, the other story says it's not. And that for reasons that are, one can imagine, but I don't have good evidence for, the threat idea wins out. Maybe just because it's more persistent. It's like every time you say there's no reason to worry, the thought occurs to you again. And every time it occurs to you, we know that mere repetition of an idea tends to make it more believable, right? There's good evidence from cognitive science for this. And so maybe it's just that the recurrence of the thought makes it more believable each time. And at some point, what you said a few minutes ago happens. It's like the delusion becomes the obvious truth and everything else has to accommodate it. So it's like the rational system says, well, at first I was dubious about this threat, but there must be evidence for it because the fast system keeps telling me there's a threat. Okay, so I guess there's a threat. And so now my job is not to assess whether there is or isn't a threat, is to figure out what the threat is. And that's, I think, when the hypotheses start to get elaborate, right? Is it the taxi drivers who are out to get me, or is it the professors, or what is it? And I think that's why you see quite elaborate narratives in some forms of psychosis. You have the executive, the rational system, developing its own story in order to make sense of the irrational belief.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. So what are you doing, and what would you like to see the field do in the future with regard to this?
Well, I mean, I'm as I say, the main thing I'm doing now, I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, kind of as a philosopher, as a theorist, and so I'm very excited that my lab is finally going to be doing some experiments. We're doing some interviews with patients to explore their delusions, something that doesn't happen nearly enough, just to ask them to tell us their stories. We're going to be doing some behavioral work and some brain imaging work to test this idea that the default mode network is implicated. I think there's a growing awareness of the interests of delusions, but there's much less work on it than you might think, despite the enormous amount of work on psychosis generally. So what I'd like to see is people focusing more on symptoms, on delusions and auditory hallucinations and so on, as opposed to the diagnoses. And I think there's a bit of a trend in that direction. There's even been some interest. I won't take credit for this because I'm not the only person to have this idea, but there's been some growing interest in the idea of psychotic symptoms as social phenomena. And I think there's some interesting work going on there. So I'm actually quite optimistic and excited about the next few years.
That's great. So if people want to learn more about delusions, what would you recommend for them?
Well, one thing I can recommend is a terrific paper that just came out in January. It's Papa and colleagues, Pappa and colleagues. Let me just get the title right. Delusional themes are more varied than previously assumed. It's a systematic review of all the themes of delusions. And so for people who are interested in learning a bit about the field, that would be a really nice place to start, because it's just a big description of what patients actually say. That paper is in Schizophrenia Bulletin, January 2025, and that might be a nice place to start.
We will link to that in the show notes. Dr. Ian Gold, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure, a real pleasure. Thanks so much.